Hello, and welcome to the last session of the Making and Meaning series for the Rochester Public Library. My name is Margaret Lejeune. I'm an artist, educator, and curator working at the intersection of art, science, and environmental studies. Our session today is titled Beyond Sunsets, Poetry and Metaphor in the Landscape. Artists have long depicted natural scenery, including mountains, valleys, coastlines, fields, and forests in their work. In this session, we will discuss the making and meaning of art that moves beyond documentation of place to investigate broader concepts within the landscape, including social, political, environmental, and cultural influences. Today, we will look at artists who are making work that is related to the notion of landscape, but perhaps not in the traditional sense of the popular painters such as Constable, Turner, Reynolds, and Monet. I'm beginning today with a familiar work by the famous Dutch painter Vincent van Gogh. Inspired by the view from his windows at the Saint-Paul-aux-Mousson Asylum in Saint-Remy in southern France, where he had spent the last 12 months or so in 1889 and 1890, seeking a reprieve from his mental illness. The Starry Night, which was made in mid-June, is both an exercise in observation of the landscape and a clear departure from it. The vision took place at night, yet the painting, among hundreds of artworks that Van Gogh made that year, was created in several sessions during the day, done under entirely different atmospheric conditions. The picturesque village nestled below the hills was based on other views. It could not be seen from his window, and the cypress at the left appears much closer than it was in person. And although certain features of the sky have been reconstructed as observed, the artist altered celestial shapes and added a sense of glow to the painting. Van Gogh assigned an emotional landscape or language to the night and the nature that he saw, and that takes us much further away from their actual appearance. Dominated by vivid blues and yellows that have been applied with a very gestural sort of verve and immediacy, the Starry Night also demonstrates how inseparable Van Gogh's vision was from the new procedures of painting he had devised, in which color and paint described a world outside the artwork, even as they sort of telegraph their own status as merely color and paint. Wheatfield with Crows is another of Van Gogh's most famous paintings. It is often claimed that this was his very last work. The menacing sky, the clouds, and the dead-end path are all said to refer to his end of life that was quickly approaching. But this is just a persistent myth. In fact, he made several other artworks after this one. Van Gogh did want his wheat fields under stormy skies to express a sense of sadness and extreme loneliness. But at the same time, he wanted to show what he considered healthy and fortifying about the countryside. He used powerful color combinations in this painting. The blue sky contrasts beautifully with the yellow-orange wheat, while the red of the path is intensified by the green bands of grass. Van Gogh and the post-impressionists helped to catapult abstraction and views of the landscape which capture emotion, poetry, and a story beyond documentation. A few years after Van Gogh's death, another Dutch painter shows a unique interest in the abstraction of the landscape. Piet Mondrian's artistic direction developed from figurative painting to an increasingly abstract style, until he reached a point where his artistic vocabulary was reduced to the simple geometric elements for which he is known today. He was a contributor to de Stijl art movement, and he evolved a non-representational form which he termed neoplasticism. This was the new pure plastic art, as he called it, which he believed was necessary in order to create universal beauty. To express this, Mondrian eventually decided to limit his formal vocabulary to 3 primary colors, red, blue, and yellow, and 3 primary values, blue, black, and white. And I should say black, blue, black, gray, and white, and 2 primary directions, that of the vertical and the horizontal. Mondrian's work had enormous influence on 20th century art, influencing not only the course of abstract painting and numerous major styles and art movements, such as color field painting, abstract expressionism, and minimalism, but also fields outside of painting, such as design, architecture, and fashion. We see massive shifts in the art world over the next several decades that usher in abstract expressionist movement. And those are followed by minimalism and conceptual art, performance art, feminist art, which offer some dynamic new ways to investigate the landscape. This is the first work made by Richard Long, and it's a work that is made solely by walking. Although it was made during the artist's first year at St. Martin's School of Art, it was really only the start of a lifetime of making art that was done exclusively by walking. Long made this piece simply by walking back and forth in a field to create an area of flattened grass, which was visible only at certain angles. So the line is a record of a journey. Although it's short, it's an expression of the energy taken to make it. This piece is typical of much of Long's work that he made outdoors, as it was inherently ephemeral and fragile, and it was not intended to last forever. Richard Long has said that places give him the energy for ideas. Like the great Walker poets, he understands that the body moving through nature gleans different truths from one that is static. For the poet, the poem is made up of meter and rhythm that emulates human movement. But for Long, his work reflects the dimensions of the body itself, the span of his stride, how many steps it takes to cover a particular distance. Classical landscape painting used the natural world as a stage, a commodity, but for Long, the natural world is something which he is integrally a part of, something which he interacts with through touch, walking, and looking. A line made by walking established Long as a minimalist and conceptual sculptor. It was also an early example of land art. Long created several pieces which harken back to the 1967 original, including circles and organic paths, some that were in dust, snow, or even in charred grass. These works include the image you see here, Walking a Line in Peru, 1972, which was a narrow path walked across a wide plain, leading to foothills of distant mountains. Nietzsche wrote, "All truly great thoughts are conceived by walking." Richard Long's great thought while walking was to make walking into his art. In an illuminated catalog essay for the exhibition Heaven and Earth, Nicholas Sertota, who was the director of the Tate Museum, writes, "In a line made by walking, a work made at the age of 22 years old, Long changed our notion of sculpture and gave new meaning to an activity as old as man himself. Nothing in the history of art quite prepared us for the originality of his action." Anna Mendieta came to prominence just shortly after Richard Long, and her works really started to take off in the 1970s. She was known for her fusion of performance, feminism, and land art. She used her own body in interaction with the landscape to make connections between nature and the femme body. Mendieta documented many of her performances in photographs and films. Despite an abbreviated career, she died in 1985 when she was only 36. She continues to be quite influential within the histories and contemporary art practices of land art, feminist art, and performance. Mendieta came to the United States from Cuba as a teenager in 1961 in forced exile. This very difficult cultural and familial separation left an indelible mark on her work, which often explores the themes of transience and mortality. Mendieta began the Silueta series that we're looking at here in 1973 while on a trip to pre-Columbian sites in Mexico. She went there with her fellow MFA students from the University of Iowa. While she was visiting these pre-Columbian sites, she became interested in indigenous Central American and Caribbean culture and rituals, incorporating ancient goddess archetypes and notions of feminine life forces into her work. In her Silueta work, her first one, she lays nude in a Zapotec tomb with white flowers strewn over her body. She went on to create many more Siluetas in Mexico and in Iowa, where she was going to graduate school. covering her body with a wide range of substances, including rocks, blood, sticks, and cloth. She also carved her figure directly into the earth, with arms overhead to represent the merger of earth and sky, or sometimes imprinting the silhouette of her body on the landscape. Captivated by the natural landscape, Mendietta's ephemeral sculptures interact directly with the earth. The photographic and filmic documents of these ephemeral works suggest the fragility of the human being in relation to forces of nature. While photographs from the Silhouette series are often presented individually, seen together, they suggest Mendietta's sustained interest in various female archetypes and the cycles of nature and life. In his series, Altered Landscapes, John Fall also intervenes into the landscape to physically change the environment. This series of pre-digital manipulated photographs was shot in the 1970s and shows a sense of playfulness and visual pun making. By fabricating the view, Fall asks us to question our perception of the landscape through added elements that reference mark-making devices that are often associated with photographs, mapping, plans, and diagrams. These gestures sometimes repeat strong formal components. They fill in information suggested by the scene or act upon information external to the photograph itself. The picturesque scenes are at once interpreted and interrupting the landscape, and they're completed by the artist's involvement in the photograph. Let me give you an example here. So in this work, he parodies Ansel Adams' famous photograph, Moonrise, Hernandez, New Mexico, by placing a pie plate among boulders at Capitol Reef National Park in Utah. The pan appears to be the same size and of similar brightness as the distant moon directly above it. He calls this picture Moonrise over Pie Pan. And by inserting these sort of mundane objects into the landscapes, Fall was making a point about how cameras distort three-dimensional space. Here we see haystack cone, which makes us think about ice cream in the way that he's created the visual lines coming forward to a point made of yellow and the haystack on top acting as the ice cream scoop itself. He was showing us that while we're looking at what we believe to be a picture, it looks like a real landscape, but it's actually false. Fall's work is a witty reflection on how we tend to conflate pictures of the natural world with the natural world itself. Agnes Denis is another artist who intervenes into the landscape. After months of preparation, in May of 1982, she oversaw the planting of a 2-acre wheat field on a landfill in Lower Manhattan, just 2 blocks from Wall Street and the World Trade Center, and it was facing the Statue of Liberty. 200 truckloads of dirt were brought in, and 285 furrows were dug by hand and cleared of rocks and garbage. Seeds were sown by hand, and the furrows were covered with soil. The field was maintained over the course of 4 months, and it was weeded, fertilized, sprayed against mildew, and an irrigation system was set up. The crop was then harvested in August, and it yielded over 1,000 pounds of golden wheat. Planting and harvesting a wheat field on land worth $4.5 billion created a powerful paradox. Wheat field was a symbol, it was a universal concept. It represented food, energy, commerce, world trade, and economics. It referred to mismanagement, waste, world hunger, and ecological concerns at the time. It really called attention to our misplaced priorities. The harvested grain from the field was set in exhibitions in 28 cities around the world. And those exhibitions were called the International Art Show for the End of World Hunger. And it was organized by the Minnesota Museum of Art. And visitors to the museum could then carry away seeds that could be planted all over the globe. Following the Wheatfield project, Denis created a man-made mountain measuring 270 meters wide by 38 meters high. It's an elliptical shape, and she oversaw the planting of 11,000 trees by 11,000 people from all over the world. And this took place over the Pinzu gravel pits in Finland. This project was officially announced by the Finnish government at the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro on the Earth Environment Day in 1992. And this was going to be Finland's contribution to help alleviate the world's ecological stress. It was sponsored by the United Nations Environmental Program and the Finnish Ministry of the Environment. The project was called Tree Mountain, and it is protected land to be maintained for at least 4 centuries. The people who planted the trees all received certificates acknowledging them as custodians of the trees. And the certificate is an inheritable document valid for 20 or more generations into the future. This was one of the earliest ecological art restoration projects of this scale that provided custodianship of the land and the resources well into the future. While Agnes Denis was, literally building landscapes as art, the painter Ansel Kiefer is both referencing place and embedding natural elements into his canvases. In his sober, epic paintings and sculptures, Kiefer explores myth, memory, German culture, and the aftermath of World War II. The artist has made iconic landscape scenes and funeral sculptures with a dense materiality, suggesting this sort of accumulation of history. He incorporates lead, books, concrete, branches, ashes, and even clothing, often burned or treated with acid, into his works. And his works are really inspired by post-Holocaust poetry, the Black Forest region of Germany, Nazi architecture, and a variety of other references. The color of lead, which Kiefer calls a support idea for his works, stands out in this painting we're looking at called The Land of the Two Rivers. This is a monumental work. It features an inscription of the names of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, a reference to the Mesopotamian civilization, in whose banks settled some of the most ancient peoples in humankind. Records have gone beyond the decay and ruins of these cultures and have made their past present in this painting. The Land of Two Rivers was preceded by a sculpture of the same title, where books that were made of lead convey a sense of history's durability. Throughout his nearly 50-year career, Kiefer has never been afraid to wrestle with history. His art, particularly its worked and layered surfaces weathered by time and nature, is very visceral and poetic. And he's often considering what the past means to our collective present and our future. This, again, another monumental canvas, references a plan devised by the Secretary of Treasury, Henry Morgenthau, during World War II. His plan was to destroy Germany's factories and turn the country into farmland after the Allied victory. Here, Kiefer imagines this pastoral outcome, with post-war Germany as a vast green country blooming with flowers. The UK artist Chris Drury would rather look down than up at the sunset. He has an ongoing fascination with fungi and has always, considered how they feed us, how they kill us, how they cure us, and how they can alter our minds. He's been making work using fungi as inspiration for many years, and he thinks really deeply about how trees communicate through the mycelium threads, forming what is often referred to as the wood wide web. He thinks about how our gut is informed by a biome of its own that is full of fungi. He's really interested in how fungi break down dead matter and return it to soil on which new life can grow. Again, he's thinking about representations of life, death, and regeneration. This work here, called Spore Print at the End of Land, is it's a circular form. It is meant to represent a mandala, and it's a visual meditation into the dichotomy of life and death. So the barn is built from chalk material, flint found within the chalk and held together by lime mortar. And then both the limestone and the chalk, these were things that were formed probably 90 million years ago. The chalk from which is made of deposits of calcium and limestone, calcite. These are the skeletal remains of coral and mollusks. The mural has been painted using those same materials, a lime wash, and it's going to slowly disappear over time, reminding us of the fragility of both ourselves and our planet. And again, referring to that cycle of life, death, and regeneration, which the fungi and mycelial network is part of. This is one of Drury's spore prints, which is made by cutting the stem of a mushroom and placing it on a piece of paper overnight. The fungi will drop its spores in the pattern of its gills, and the resulting image can be fixed with spray fixative and then scanned with a computer. This particular spore print, you can see, has handwritten text that radiates in lines out using brown ink on white paper. And the text that we read lists all the names of the European brown-spored mushrooms. Drury's work has been conceived in 2D form, 3D form, and installation work. And this is an example of a hanging mushroom installation that's made from lichen that covered blackthorn. This lichen grew in the hedgerows surrounding the artist's house, and it was especially prevalent in the winter months. Drury had designed this piece just prior to the pandemic, and it was supposed to be installed in February 2020. And once the world went into lockdown, he had to reconceive how he could possibly install this work. So he and his partner collected all the lichen, which they strung together in his studio. There was 546 strands with 3,743 pieces of lichen. Each 4-meter long strand was placed on a full-scale cross-section drawing that he created and was then tied in place, wrapped around a card, and put in a box that could be mailed. It took months for he and his partner to prepare this piece for shipping. And the work was then installed and photographed by the workers in the gallery. Chris was never able to go on site because of the pandemic lockdown. The work is interesting in the fact that its inception, its construction, and its installation actually mirrors the very nature of the mycelium network and the fungi that Drury is so inspired by. It acts as this sort of connective tissue and creates this symbiotic relationship between the artist, the gallery, the workers, nature, the mycelial network. Again, this great cyclical connectivity. Another artist who relies on community to create their work in the landscape is Christo and Jeanne-Claude. This project, The Gates, was first conceived in the late 1970s, and like most of their works, this logistically complex project was realized only after several decades of development, personal fundraising to create the work, and then working very closely with the city to bring the project to fruition. This project was installed in New York City Central Park, a space that was originally designed by Frederick Law Olmsted. And each gate was a rectilinear 3-sided rigid frame that rested on a steel footing and supported a beautifully colored, sort of saffron colored panel that hung loosely from the top and could blow in the wind. The gates themselves matched the color of the fabric. And the statistics for this project are really impressive. There's over 7,500 gates that span over 23 miles of walkways. Each gate was 16 feet high, with widths varying according to the path's width. And despite a brief exhibition period from only February 12th to the 27th, the gates were such a complex testament to two really controversial topics in contemporary art. One, how do you create meaningful public art? And two, how does art respond to and impact our relationship with the built environment? Following this, in the early aughts, Penelope Umbrico began appropriating images found using search engines and picture sharing websites such as Flickr. She began the project Suns from Sunsets from Flickr in 2006 when looking for the most subject. So she was interested in knowing what was the most photographed subject on Flickr. And she found that sunsets was tagged the most with over 500,000 results. She found it really peculiar that the sun, this quintessential giver of life and warmth and constant in our lives, this symbol of enlightenment, spirituality, all things sort of ephemeral and omnipotent, was also so ubiquitously photographed. And it was now subsumed on the internet, right? The singular, glowing, warm object had been made multiplied in the electronic space of the web. So perhaps part of the beauty of taking a picture of the sunset is that while you're doing it, it's actually likely that millions of other people are doing it at the same time as well. And Umbrico was interested in exploring the idea of this collective practice, something that we all engage in despite any artistic concern, knowing that there are millions before and probably millions after who will try to take a similar shot. Well, the intent of photographing a sunset may be to capture something ephemeral or to assert an individual's subjectivity or point of view. The result is really the opposite of that, right? Through the technology of our common cameras, we experience the power of millions of synoptic views, all shared the same way at the same moment. To claim individual authorship while photographing a sunset is to disengage from the collective practice and therefore negate a large part of why capturing a sunset is so irresistible in the first place. In her series Range of Masters Photography, Umbrico considers an analog history of photography within the digital torrent that is its current technological manifestation. For this project, she focuses on iconic images of mountains in various online and print media, such as Aperture's Master of Photography book. Umbrico downloaded hundreds of camera apps to her iPhone to re-photograph the Master's mountains and process them through multiple filters on her camera phone apps. We see photo grain, dot screen, pixels, and screen resolution colliding that create abstractions and new iteration of these images. The colors of the camera app filters blend with the disorienting effects of the iPhone's gravity sensor, which dislodge any perception of stability in the mountain. It also shakes up the sense of this master photographer idea, almost always gendered as male, and the photographic medium as a whole. So in this work, the mountain, the old landmark, the site of orientation, and sometimes of spiritual contemplation, becomes unstable, mobile, has no gravity, and changes with each digital example. Another photographer, Barry Underwood, he's interested in melding a lens-based practice with light painting. So his work illuminates environments that hold rich ecological and cultural histories and are sites of destructive human behavior. By building and photographing sculptures of light, Underwood is really interested in showing the ways humans intervene in the natural environment while highlighting how society normalizes these exploitations. His work makes visible the cultural constructs of wilderness, and by extension, the environmental issues related to human use and abuse of natural resources. Using the landscape as a stage and the intervention as actors, Underwood's light installations trace what happened on a site. The shapes, lines, discordant colors, and the strange perspectives that he used are made really vivid with LED lights. Within the photographs, these sculptures visually interact with the landscape. He creates these very balanced compositions that lure the viewer in, while the altered perspectives destabilize the figure-ground relationship and disrupt our expectations. These artist-made light intrusions refer to the scarring, the seepage, the divisions, the removal, and sometimes the infestations that have been inflicted on nature. Each gesture points to ways humans force their will on the natural environment, whether by erecting a literal fence, dumping toxic waste, or designating property lines on survey maps. Underwood says that these works demonstrate the paradox of the human relationship on nature, calling attention to the dichotomy of resilience and fragility embedded in both. Each of his photographs begins with many hours of location scouting and searching, talking to the locals, learning the place's ecological and social histories, and sometimes even studying satellite imagery. He visits tourist sites and science centers to gather narratives about the place where he is going to spend time and make these photographs. His goal is to learn how humans in the past and in the present engage with these particular places and more broadly with the landscape itself. So through these investigations, Underwood has come to understand that landscape contains rich layers of information, providing different kinds of ways of telling stories. Like Underwood, photographer Dana Fritz constructs her photographs. However, her interventions happen in the darkroom. The photographs in the series, Views Removed, render trees, stones, and other natural materials in ways that their scale and perspective become ambiguous, combining more than one negative to create a landscape view that exists only in a final print. The composition and contrast in the resulting silver gelatin prints emulate the white paper background and equivocal space in ink painting. These are free of the technical constraints of photography, but instead are inspired by questions about Eastern and Western pictorial space, the landscape as a construct, and the inherent tensions between the real and the ideal. In Fritz's series, Terrara Gigantica, The World Under Glass, she frames the world's largest enclosed landscapes as possible impossibilities. Here we're looking at Biosphere 2's ocean in the Arizona desert, the Henry Doorly Zoo in the desert in the Great Plains landscape of Nebraska, the Eden Project's tropical rainforest in the notoriously gray and cool Cornwall, England. These vivaria are enclosed environments where plants are grown amidst carefully constructed representations of the natural world to entertain visiting tourists. At the same time, they support scientific observation and research. Taken together, these architectural and engineering marvels stand as working symbols of our current and complex relationships with the natural world. Fritz has said that these places, which were built in the late 1980s, help us to understand. Let me start this again. So these places were built in the late 1980s to research possible space colonization. Biosphere 2 was designed as an airtight replica of the Earth's environment. This glass and metal frame structure contains a tropical rainforest, mangrove wetlands, a fog desert, savanna grasslands, and an ocean with a coral reef. And although this space is no longer airtight, it's been repurposed to research sustainability. While the technical and aesthetic demands of these varying missions of these built environments is informed by the physical design of these spaces, the required juxtapositions of natural and artificial elements also generate unintentionally striking visual paradoxes that Fritz noticed. These include vistas referring to the idea of landscape, thresholds signifying architecture, and fragments that focus on details. In these carefully considered exhibits, away from the crowd of visitors, the illusion gives way. In these margins, these liminal spaces, the natural and the artificial sometimes meet. They overlap, they bleed together, they collide, they resist, and they contrast with one another. The visual richness of these small details leads to big questions about what it means to create and contain landscapes. They ask us to think about our interactions with and attitudes about the natural world. They ask us to consider whether these spaces supplement or replace the natural world. They ask us to reflect on the distinction between what is natural and what is artificial. This series, Self-Portrait Well Buried, builds upon the wider feminist tradition that Anna Mendieta introduced and I spoke about earlier. Instead of leaving an absence where her body once lay, Calivas actively inserts her figure within her photographs. In Self-Portrait Well Buried #9, the artist's body is visible, emerging beneath crumbled sand, darker pockets arising where her limbs recently rested. In the 12th work in this series, the artist's body is initially invisible, enveloped in layers of gelatinous mud. Dark reeds populate the right side of the composition, bristling with texture and obscuring a potentially hidden photographer. Light dapples over the patchy mud, rippling over footprints and pools of murky water. We see the artist's hand finally becoming visible near the top of the picture plane, pointing resolutely toward the sky, held up above the marshland to avoid damaging her wired shutter. In these images, she exists within nature, buried within various forms of earth. Calivas asserts a new curiosity about the female body in the landscape. Her black and white images unexpectedly taunt us, at once being generous and then at the same time withholding. She is still and she is active. She is passive and she is movement. Her pictures are a part of photography's long conversation about the tension between chance, the idea of the decisive moment, and control, that of the staged image. These pictures live in a realm of female experience and feminist thinking and making. The work suggests a new creation myth, a maternal purging or dissolving of the original form to make way for a new body. Another artist examining the relationship between the female body and the natural environment is Sherry Sampson. She has worked for over 25 years as an interdisciplinary artist, working in environmental performance, sculpture, and video art. At the age of 53, she was diagnosed with hereditary breast cancer. In processing this information, she committed to transposing it into art. She turned the camera on herself, onto what she called her confounding new identity, the breast cancer patient. Her body thus became a site of artistic research. Many hours of audio-visual footage and photographs documenting the diagnosis, the tests, treatments, post-surgeries. Images seen here are part of a set of performances for the camera in collaboration with another photographer during the months that she was undergoing chemotherapy. The image on the left is a selection from a series she called the Orchard series. It was shot in a small organic apple orchard during the bloom time in the spring of 2017. And it depicts both the orchard and the artist in the process of transformation. Holes had been dug for the planting of young trees, and Sampson saw these as a metaphor for the abyss of illness at that time, but also a promise of new life. In the image on the right, from the Cottonwood series, we see an image here where the artist is situated in front of a large, half-alive cottonwood tree that is in the woodlands near the Mississippi River. The tree has been struck by lightning, but has weathered the storm. And Sampson had just finished her last round of chemotherapy, and the images were shot just days before she underwent breast augmentation surgery. She said this work was the last opportunity to make work with the body that she had known and worked in her entire life. While Sherry Sampson performs with the landscape as the backdrop of her work, Sandra Masterson explores the relationship between place, space, and people through the visual language of the soil itself. Her work focuses on this thin layer of earth in which we bury our dead, we plant our seeds, we lay down our ancestral roots, and for which we continue to take up arms to defend. In this painting here, Dissolve Triptych, Masterson literally creates work from the landscape. In this composition, which appears to reference sunsets or waterways, perhaps farm fields, she scumbles the surface with soil collected at numerous points that she collected while partaking in a walking exercise, something that is imperative to her practice, and one that is inspired by Richard Long, who we discussed earlier in this presentation. Masterson says that her work is as much about the process as it is about the finished piece. The act of walking and collecting soils and plant materials is central to her art practice. She sees the process of experimentation and direct engagement with the materials as a form of silent poetry. In this installation shot here, we see the work titled Dissolve 4 and 5. These works were created with soils collected during a coastal walk from the Sennin coast to Land's End on the far western tip of England. To conclude the lecture today, we will look at the work of contemporary photographer Millie Tibbs, who is a professor of photography at Wayne State University in Detroit, Michigan. Tibbs states that moving to the American Midwest marked a distinct shift in her artistic practice. It wasn't a conscious one, she said, but one that surfaced through a nostalgic longing for what she saw as a lacking in the glaciated urban environment of southern Michigan: access to dramatic natural landscape. Tibbs became increasingly interested in the idea of landscape and the cliched imagery that fills that longing. Her work has evolved into an investigation of idealized landscape imagery, the kind that's easily consumable and often commodified. Tibbs says that she's fascinated with the landscape genre and its language, the aesthetic imposed onto the land through photographic framing, and the historical rhetoric inherent in these images that justified American manifest destiny and imperialism through what is left out, namely the inhabitants. Tibbs asserts that the landscape is a highly charged symbol at the service of specific ideologies, representing the projected identities and desires of those who use it. Her current work combines landscape photography and darkroom sleight of hand. Using photographic images of mountains as a surrogate for the sublime experience, Mount Analog explores the paradoxical relationship between photography, which can only represent what is in front of the camera's lens, and the ineffable nature of the sublime experience. Using a single negative and multiple exposures in the darkroom, Tibbs creates illusory abstract geometries that overlay and redefine romantic mountain photographs. Through this process, she examines the mind's attempt to rationalize and tame that which exceeds the limits of perception. The production of this work is twofold. The first part is experimental. Tibbs has traveled to iconic landscapes to photograph them. She's been to the Andes in southern Argentina and Chile, and has made 2 separate trips to photograph the Alps in France and Switzerland, and has traveled to the Himalayas, hiking over 400 miles with her 4x5 field camera in her backpack. The second part of the process is studio-based. In the darkroom, Tibbs uses masking and multiple exposures to remake the landscapes. It's during this time that she re-examines her experience of place and crafts a new visual language to express it. The formal strategies that Tibbs employs in this work are informed by the op artists of the 1960s, who used abstraction to challenge the nature of vision. Like the op artist, Tibbs is interested in the space between what we see and what we know. She employs these unique visual phenomena through photography, a medium intrinsically tied to optical vision, as a way to undermine its authority and truth value. Through this process, Tibbs explores the assertion of the mind's attempt to rationalize and tame that which exceeds the limits of perception. Thank you so much for joining us today for the last series in the Making and Meaning series for the Public Library. I hope that you'd enjoyed your time with us. If you like this series, please check out the 5 other recordings that are available on the Rochester Public Library's YouTube page.